I know we're short on time, so I will jump straight in and then answer any questions that we have at the end. We're going to talk about bots and COVID misinformation, and within that, of course, how we can detect them, that touches on network analysis along with deep learning as part of artificial intelligence. So I just wanted to open with the question to ourselves, really, of what is a bot, because I think sometimes there's a very skeptical view of them in general, and I think starting from a shared definition is a good place to start. So simply put, short for robot, and a piece of software that automatically carries out a task. Now, what that task actually is, of course, depends. And so often when we hear bot, we're thinking about this malign social media bot that is somehow corrupting everything that we see. But a bot, like many tools, has lots of different uses and can be used for positive social change or negative impact. And so I'm sure that most people here will be familiar with at least some bots, whether it's a chat bot on a website that enables the user to give feedback, whether it is the likes of Siri or Alexa that acts as a voice bot, or whether it's in medicine where they're being used to do things like support people with mental health issues. And in fact, that isn't entirely new. One of the first chatbots, Eliza, was created by IBM in the 60s to do exactly that. Now, it was incredibly rudimentary compared to what we see today, but the concept itself isn't new. But of course, on the other side, we see bots being used for malign intent and often for criminal intent, collecting our personal details, email addresses, passwords, conducting very simplistic cyber attacks, or spamming us. So how it can be used really changes. The focus that we are talking about really, I guess, though, is how bots are involved in the infodemic and in social media. And so I think at its core, bots are really there to replicate human activity. So if we think about the sorts of things that a user would do on social media, they might create content, interact with users, comment, get involved in a conversation, or they might amplify content that they like or dislike for some reason. And those are the sorts of activities that we see bots take part in as well. Now, I should say that the first two elements of that, creating the content and interacting with users, is actually much harder generally to automate. And yes, there have been trials, and lots of big companies have demonstrated some pretty good capabilities. But on the whole, at the moment, I would say that the majority of the time, the role that we see bots in is that last role. It's in amplifying the content. And I think at this point, it's just worth drawing a slight distinction, because we have bots that are these pieces of software automatically carrying out a task, but we also have bot-like activity, and sometimes differentiating between something that is entirely a piece of software conducting an activity automatically and something in between, sometimes referred to as a cyborg, that has some human interaction, or a human acting in a very bot-like fashion. Drawing those distinctions in terms of detection can be quite difficult, but also in terms of the impact. So it's just worth keeping in mind as we talk about this subject. So when we think about what bots are doing, out there potentially rebroadcasting, amplifying content, what impact do we actually see it having on social media? Well, I would say there are two main parts to this. And the first really key part is that they create this artificial perception of popularity. And by that, I mean, it's not popularity that is organic or driven by humans directly because they're interested. It is the perception of popularity that we would see if we're looking at how many retweets something has got, how many reposts, how many comments or similar. And when bots act in this way to create this artificial perception of popularity, it has two key benefits for them. So the first is algorithmic. So often the platforms themselves will reward content that appears to be popular. So whether it's Twitter trending or more visibility, that's one aspect of it. And then the second part is the very human part. So there are psychological benefits conveyed by that artificial perception of popularity. And by that, I mean that humans are more likely to engage with and to interact with, to retweet themselves, content that already appears to be popular. And there are lots and lots of good pieces of research out there that set out the psychological traits behind that. And so all of that means that while we start with an artificial perception of popularity, it then potentially drives real popularity. And that's a really key point for us. The second part is that there's been some good research on showing that how, as bots proliferate within a network and how the content proliferates, we end up with a poorer quality of conversation. We end up with the good content being suppressed and actually the poor content becoming the majority in that network and taking over the role then of what is shared. So I think the takeaway for the impact of the bots is that the artificial popularity actually drives real engagement. And secondly, that information overload decreases the quality of the overall conversation that we see. So when we're looking, and I think people previous to this have already talked about early detection, how do we actually identify them and identify these sorts of artificial amplification early? Two main methods that we look at. The first is network analysis, and the second is machine learning. So I think I've got, I think there are a couple of people that are following this that are actually going to talk about social network analysis in more detail. But for those that aren't familiar, in very basic terms, a network analysis is usually conducted by looking at a graph. And in that graph, we have a circle, which would represent an entity, and a line to another circle, which would represent a relationship between them. And if we think about social media, that might be a Twitter account, and the relationship between them is that one of them follows the other or that one of them retweets the other. And when you add all of those together and you look at a conversation on a much larger scale, what you end up with is a network graph like the one you can see on the right of this presentation. And so when we're using this approach to identify bots, we're looking at lots and lots of different features. And just a couple of them I've drawn out are things like the position of that account within the network, the role it plays. So is it a seeder of information? Does it act as a bridge between two communities? What role does it play? And then how is it connected? Is it only connected to other accounts that in turn exhibit bot-like behavior? Or does it have a rich and diverse number of connections to others that are very likely to be humans? So we look at all of these different features in order to try and identify bots or bot-like behavior.
1 minute left.
And the last, or the next part of that identification is using machine learning. So instead of looking at the network, now we're looking at individual accounts, the language they use, their activity, their use of emoticons, and we're building deep learning models that then are able to identify bots or bot-like activity based on that. And on top of all of that, we then layer other AI models to try and detect things like the categorization of misinformation. So rather than just, is it misinformation, yes or no, actually looking at the different types. And then lastly, I'll just leave this up, is an example of what that looks like when we identify some misinformation. And you can see a bot network being identified. And if we had more time, we could start to talk about how those patterns emerge and how they can be differentiated from an authentic looking network. So that's it from me, hopefully just about on time, and I'm happy to take any questions.